Our top story, though, today is the Prime Minister's Rwanda bill has passed its first hurdle in the House of Lords, 206 voting against a motion to block it, 84 voting in favour. That's a majority of 122.
It wasn't entirely without opposition, though, and there's potentially more to come. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, warned the plan is leading the nation down a damaging path, while the former Home Secretary, Lord Ken Clarke, said he can no longer support the bill in its current form. Well, joining us with more on this is both our political correspondent, Alicia Fitzgerald, and the Conservative commentator, Benedict Spence. Good morning to both of you.
Morning.
Benedict, some of the peers were pretty unhappy with the bill in its current form. They are trying to change it, tweak it. How much can they actually do that?
Well, how much can they actually affect it, send it back, and then actually whether or not any of that survives is the key thing. I mean, they can amend it all they want, but the reality is that if it then gets sent back to the House of Commons, the likelihood is that the government will just sort of strip that all out and start again.
Well, what's the point of the House of Lords, then?
Well, this is a very good question. It's a very long-ended constitutional question that we could be here for a very long time. Right now, that's ultimately what it's there for. The whole point is that we're supposed to have a House of Lords that's full of experts and sort of grandees and people with lots of experience, and they then go back to the Commons and say, well, this might not work, and then the government goes, well, thanks very much, we're still going to push ahead with that anyway.
But if they can't wreck it and they can't change it, could they delay it?
They can delay it, and I think that that's going to be the attitude, that's going to be the approach, because everybody knows that this government is on a borrowed time. I think it's well beyond saying it's streaking in the last chance saloon. And I think they've already drunk that saloon dry. Ultimately, this is a question of trying to get the legislation in place to get the planes sent off so that the public can see before the next general election that this government has actually got a plan to stopping the boats. It's probably not going to happen in time, and I think members of the House of Lords know that, so they are going to do what they can to waylay it as much as they can. This is just a question of frustrating Rishi Sunak as much as they can, which some people might say is not a great way to do politics by frustration, but that is the system that we have.
Rishi Sunak may very well be frustrated. So too, I think, a journalist who keep asking the Prime Minister, well, when will the first plane take off? And there's no answer to that, is there, Alicia?
There's not. I mean, Rishi Sunak most recently has said he thinks there'll be flights by spring, but the trouble is he keeps setting himself deadlines and he's met none of them. So obviously this has been going on for a couple of years now. The Rwanda scheme first was floated in 2022, so it's been a really long time, and we've had absolutely no migrants actually going to Rwanda. So he kept setting himself these deadlines, not meeting them. That is why we're kind of seeing a bit more vagueness from the Prime Minister about when these flights will take off, because that, of course, gives him a bit more wiggle room. No one can turn around and say, but you said this time and you didn't meet it.
I mean, this feels a little bit Alice in Wonderlandy now. I mean, there is obviously some strategising that is going on that makes the Conservatives want to keep this Rwanda plan front and centre, even though we are discussing the possibility that it may never happen, that there are implications for the way that this is going to eventually actually be, whether or not it's in terms of international law and the like. But why is it then that Conservatives feel that even if this is Alice in Wonderland politicking, it needs to be front and centre? Is it just because it creates a dividing line between them and Labour?
I suppose so. I think that's something that no one really can get to the bottom of at the moment. You know, why has Rishi Sunak, out of all the things he could have chosen the Rwanda scheme?
Yeah.
But I think the trouble is now is we're so far into it, so much money has been spent on it, so much time has been spent on it, that the logic there is that if the Conservative government were now to turn around and say, you know what, this isn't working, or maybe just try and focus more time on something else, people will just say, well, hang on, why have we spent all this time so far on this? Does that not show maybe that you weren't really clear on the scheme in the first place? So that's kind of the logic there. Whether or not people agree with it is another question.
I think it's a sort of a Brexit 2.0. It's the government being able to then turn around to an electorate and say, well, we don't actually have full control over it because everything is being waylaid by, I don't know, be it lawyers, be it the House of Lords, be it the
It's deflection.
Yes, it is. It's an attempt to create a sort of a golem, if you like, to actually set yourself up against. It's also, if you're going to be quite cynical about it, the odds are the Conservatives are going to lose the next general election. So it's a wonderful trap to set for the Labour Party to say, well, here it is, here's a policy, we've put it in place, what is your alternative? Because right now the Labour Party doesn't really seem to have much of an alternative rather than we're going to process faster. What does that mean? Does it mean rubber stamping?
Well, they smash the gangs. That's what they'll say every time we ask.
Again, how are you going to do that?
Process abroad.
What does that mean? None of this is actually going into any detail. It sounds wonderful, but here is a tangible process. If you then set up a situation where you put in place a policy, no matter how small, and the Labour Party, the first thing they'll do is they'll tear it down. and then the Labour Party has to actually get to grips with the issue of people coming across the channel, it makes it very difficult. And the Conservatives can then turn around and say, well, we were going to be tough. We'd set in place this plan. And the Labour Party, the first thing they did when they came in, they got rid of it and they let in more people. So you can sort of see the electioneering there already starting.
You can, but you also wonder, is this any way to run a country? Is this any way to set policy? This sounds like pure politicking rather than anything concrete, tangible, or actually functional. I mean, how many people are ever going to end up in Rwanda, even if these flights do start? What's the capacity that they've got? We hear it's in the hundreds. There are 51,000 undocumented people who still don't have the legal right to stay in this country. Are they all going to go to Rwanda?
Exactly, and I think people who are criticising the scheme will probably argue that Rwanda is more of a headline grabber. It's very easy to say the Rwanda scheme. It sticks in people's minds. The public know what it is.
Hours, isn't it?
And it's a very short and snappy phrase, whereas Labour saying we're going to combat criminal gangs and we're going to process asylum claims offshore and abroad. That doesn't really stick in the same way. On the flip side, though, lots of people could definitely argue that is it not better to have a broader and less detailed approach rather than a very detailed one that doesn't seem to be working. So that's also up for debate as well.
Should we talk about a bit of a breakthrough? Just in the last 24 hours, in the DUP, the executive have voted to endorse a deal to return to power sharing after 2 years. Alicia, remind us, for everyone who thinks, hang on, what's going on here? Why did it all collapse and why now are we seeing progress?
So the Democratic Unionist Party basically collapsed the Northern Ireland executive. So obviously we have devolved administrations across the UK. So Wales has its own government, Scotland has its own government, and so does Northern Ireland. The DUP collapsed their part in Northern Ireland because of the Brexit deal made by Boris Johnson, which meant that their trade routes were experiencing higher levels of checks, and they were basically still having to abide by EU law when the rest of the UK wasn't. So any goods going from the UK to the Northern Ireland were subject to these massive EU infringed checks, basically. They have just been arguing that it was not fair. They want to see these checks gone. And eventually now they seem to have made some breakthrough. And
what is the breakthrough?
The government have basically said that they will rid all of those checks across those two borders so that we'll basically have free trade movement between Northern Ireland and the UK.
Can they do that?
I mean, the devil will be in the detail, and we wait to see the detail because we need to see what the legislation is. The DUP say that it meets their seven criteria, the seven statements that they put out. Presumably, therefore, it's going to have to do quite a lot of heavy lifting because there are a lot of sort of quite substantial absolutes there about there will be no border between Northern Ireland and in the UK.
And this presumably needs buy-in from the Irish government and or the EU.
Yeah, it's one of those that you kind of think, well, it's fantastic. We've got over this first hurdle. The DUP says, yes, this meets all of our criteria. But until we actually see what it is that the government's proposing, you have no idea whether or not this is actually viable. And as you say, yes, if the Irish government, if the European Union actually aren't on board with it, whether or not all aspects of the Conservative Party are necessarily on board with it, we know how fractious an issue this has been, remains to be seen. But again, we're talking about a very narrow sort of timeline here, whether or not this can actually be done and implemented before the next general election. If it can, then that's another win, potentially. I say another win, a win that Rishi Sunak can chalk up. But if not, then it's just another example of something that the Labour Party will have to inherit, ultimately. And, so you said that this isn't necessarily a great way to run a country, but politicking is kind of what we do at the moment. It just seems to be how this country is run, is not necessarily does this policy work, but how does this play in the media, how does this play with the electorate, and what is the opposition's response? For a very long time, the Labour Party have been able to coast. Ultimately, as we get down to the crunch time, we're going to have to be seeing a lot more in terms of physical policy from them.
Benedict, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Alicia,
guys.
thank you too for helping us steer through some of the tricky politics stories.